beautiful day. We are very pleased today to have this get-together to talk about some issues that are very pertinent to Bucks County and to our members. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we have our BCAR president, Alex Schneider, here today. We have our immediate past president, Chris Beedling. We have Jamie Ridge, who's the CEO of the Suburban Realtors Alliance, of which we are shareholders. Thanks for being here, Jamie. And so today we have to introduce Representative Santarsiero. We have Todd Polinchak, who is a past president of the Bucks County Association of Realtors. And in January 2016, Todd is going to be sworn in as the president of the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. We have not had a PAR president from Bucks County since 1972. So we are thrilled. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Todd to introduce the representative.
Thank you. That's kind of you. I made my introduction for this state representative in really big font, and I still need my glasses, so that's a bad sign. So thanks. Yeah, I'm honored. I've been on the board for about 9 or 10 years. I was your president in 09, and going up to PAR, it's just been really good to do the volunteer work and just kind of work as an advocate for our industry. And the fact that all you came out today, I really appreciate that, because it shows you care about your industry as well. So thank you so much. So without further ado, I want to introduce the representative. It's my pleasure today to introduce Representative Steve Santarsiero. I'm sure many of you are aware that after witnessing from his office building the tragic events of September 11th, Representative Santarsiero made a life-changing decision to focus his energies on education and community service. He left his law practice to become a social studies teacher at Ben Salem High School. A few years later, he was elected to the Lower Makefield Board of Supervisors and spearheaded a plan to help mitigate flooding caused by development. By the way, that ordinance received an award from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Elected to our State House in 08, Representative Santarsiero recently introduced House Bill 1299, which would create a flood insurance premium assistance task force to help address flood insurance concerns here at the state level. I know many of you, like me, have had several real estate deals affected by the Bigger Waters Act in the last several years. Bigger Waters brought some stability to the National Flood Insurance Program, but initial rate changes had a dramatic effect on the real estate market, as you know. Representative Santarsiero believes, and I'm sure many of you agree, that these federal programs will not be enough to protect our whole neighborhoods from the impact of flood insurance premium increases that are more than doubling to some of our residents. It's great to know that we have someone like Representative Santarsiero in state government who understands the complexities of flood insurance and how new flood zone rates and high rates can affect the homeowners in our industry. So without further ado, Representative Santarsiero, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks, Todd. And just so Todd doesn't feel that he's alone in this, these are my reading glasses. I try to keep them with me as much as possible. I turned 50 this year, so it's becoming more and more of an issue. Thank you all for having me this morning and for coming out and taking some time out of your busy workday. I appreciate that. This is a great turnout, particularly the week before Labor Day, so I really do appreciate it. And we've got some important things to talk about. And I really wanted to have this opportunity for a couple of reasons. One, to get to know you better, obviously, but also to really ask for your support and partnership in trying to get House Bill 1299 moving, precisely because it is such an important issue that affects so many of our communities across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to really begin by talking about that, if I may. As Todd said in his introductory remarks, the Bigger Waters Act really was kind of a shock to the system for many of our neighborhoods. It put many of our homeowners in a very, very difficult position, rolling back the subsidies that had been coming from the federal government. At the same time that FEMA was doing a remapping of the floodplain throughout the country. And I can tell you that, at least in my district, and I'm sure this is the case in many other places as well, that that remapping of the floodplain really worked a disservice and was really in many ways fundamentally unfair to many homeowners. because it went about a process that did not take into consideration some of the things that had changed in the region. I'll give you an example. In Lower Makefield Township, whereas Todd noted I was a township supervisor, after the 3 really significant floods of the last decade, we undertook some engineering controls that were designed to mitigate flooding tendencies going forward. So, for example, we put backflow preventers in our storm sewers. Those backflow preventers, essentially, when there is a flood and you get waters coming back up from the river through the storm sewers that are usually intended to take water out, the water comes back up. These backflow preventers prevent that from happening. So that cuts off one other avenue of potential flooding. Another thing we did, we used to get a lot of flooding from the Delaware Canal, which, as you know, is parallel to the river. And so that area between the river and the canal, we'd get it from both sides. And in fact, in some neighborhoods, the only time they ever got flooding was from the canal, not from the river. But it happened that those events would happen simultaneously because it was those tremendous stormwater events that would create the flooding in the first place. We had the canal dredged. I went down to Philadelphia as the chairman of the Board of Supervisors. I got Governor Rendell to release the money to do that. And then we had the culvert that goes over the canal widened so that more water would be able to pass through. Our engineers told us, and later events proved, that those things made a real difference in preventing further flooding from happening. But when FEMA came and redid their maps, they didn't want to hear anything about any of that. And none of that was sufficient in their analysis to say that these particular neighborhoods and these particular homes were no longer in the floodplain. So you had that double whammy of bigger waters plus the remapping that really put many of our neighborhoods in very difficult positions. And I have been working very closely with citizens groups in my State House district, but then also with some of my colleagues in the legislature on both sides of the aisle, whose districts in a similar way have been affected by these changes, in talking about what can we do at the state level. Now, initially, we thought that the federal government was going to offer some significant relief. And they've offered some, but in the long term, it's really not enough to deal with this problem. And so our fear is still that if we at the state level do not act, we could very easily be in that situation, and in some cases we're in that situation already, where people who purchased their homes, in some cases 20, 30 years ago, with one set of expectations about what they were going to have to do by way of flood insurance, are now in a position where the game has been changed, the rules have been changed midstream, no pun intended, and they can no longer afford the flood insurance, and they really can't sell their home either because no one is going to want to buy the house knowing that they've got to take that premium on. So it really makes an untenable situation, and it threatens to turn some of these neighborhoods into ghost towns. And that's not good for the other homes in the neighborhood in terms of their values. It's not good for our municipalities in terms of potential crime and tax revenue. And so it's something where I think the state really does need to step in. So I introduced earlier this year House Bill 1299. And the idea behind House Bill 1299 is not to come right out of the gate with a prescription about what has to happen, but rather to take a relatively short period of time, 6 months, to thoroughly study the problem and come up with some proposed solutions. And my observation in Harrisburg is that when we do that, and we've done it, for example, most recently on some of the aspects of education funding, whether it's special education or more recently the funding formula by which we send out money to the school districts, you're much more likely to get broad buy-in and broad bipartisan support, which then makes it easier for an ultimate solution to pass the legislature in both chambers. So that's what 1299 is dedicated to do. And it includes some language that kind of would guide the work of the commission in studying the issue, because at the end of the day, really what we should be moving toward, in my view, is some kind of a fund which could then provide subsidies for homeowners. And that money then would be driven out to the areas where they're needed most. Now, one part of that I'd like the this task force to take a look at is whether we can incentivize municipalities at the same time to do some of the things that Lower Makefield did that I just described. Some engineering controls that will help mitigate flood tendencies over time. So this is really an opportunity where we can both help homeowners and address a really serious problem with our real estate industry, and at the same time incentivize better policies at the local level, which over time hopefully will help mitigate flooding. And so those policies could be things like I described, those engineering controls, the backflow preventers, dredging projects, but they also could be something like the low impact development ordinance that Todd referenced when he was introducing me. And that was something we passed also in Lower Makefield about 10 years ago. And what that ordinance does essentially is it tries to manage stormwater issues when new developments come in. And just as in a nutshell, as an example, what it does is it says, when you go and build a new development, try to design it in a way so that as much stormwater as possible is going to stay on site and be infiltrated back into the ground on site, so it's not going into the watershed, going down into streams and tributaries of rivers and causing further flooding problems downstream. And so that's really a good way to help mitigate the flooding tendencies too. And again, that could be another piece of an incentive program for getting money to help offset the cost of flood premiums. If we were to say, for example, the towns, if you enact something like a low impact development ordinance, you might be eligible for more money, or however the formula works, you might be higher on the ladder for getting that. So that's kind of the overview of what we need to do. And the other piece, obviously, is we need to get a really good sense of really what the magnitude of the problem is. How many properties are we talking about approximately across the Commonwealth? What is the cost differential between what people have been paying and what they now will have to pay over the next few years in premiums? And therefore, what can we reasonably put toward this effort on the state side? Now, all that, of course, is occurring and would occur at a good time for us fiscally, because, of course, we are in the midst of a budget negotiation right now. Or some days it seems like less negotiation and more just this, But hopefully we will get to a point pretty soon where we actually do have, we have a budget and we have some more recurring revenue, and that might be an opportunity for a program like this to get funded. So, in the best case scenario, all those things could come together at the same time. Now, we have bipartisan support for this bill already. It's building, and I'm continually reaching out to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try to get more support so we can get this bill into committee and then ultimately onto the floor of the House. But we could use your help in that regard too. And Todd was good enough to be at our press conference about a month and a half ago or so down in Yardley as we kicked this effort off. And I thought that worked out very well, and we did get some good write-ups in the press about that and spreading the word. But we can continue to use your help in reaching out to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, here in Bucks County and frankly elsewhere in the state as well, to try to build support. Because the more that we build that support, the more likely it is then that we could actually get the legislation moving. And I just want this passed, to be honest. I don't care ultimately if there's a decision made that, and I'll, in all seriousness, tell you the politics of this. A lot of times, I'm a Democrat, I'm in the minority in the House, so a lot of times, they won't move a Democratic bill. That's fine. If they want to give it to a Republican member who supports it, if they want to let it run in the Senate first, under someone else's name, and have it come back to the House, there's no pride in authorship as far as I'm concerned. This is a serious problem and we need to move it. So that's what I want to do. And if you, in your discussions, you get the sense that there may be some willingness to do it that route, that's fine. I'm fine with that. But I really want to try to get this moving because we have a lot of residents who are in a very difficult spot, and it's only going to get worse. So that is that piece. I'm happy to answer questions on that. I'm happy to talk a little bit about where we are with the budget, because I know that does impact everything too, right down from school taxes to everyone's, a lot of other services that are offered in the state. I'm happy to give you a little bit of update on that if you're interested. So, the stress on the budget issue right now is between the governor, who wants recurring revenue in the form of some kind of a tax increase. Certainly the Marcellus Shale gas severance tax is part of what he's proposing. So too are some broad-based tax increases. On the other side, the Republican leadership in both the House and the Senate are looking for some reform on principally the pension issue. And so the stress is trying to kind of come to the middle on both of those issues. It sounds as if the governor has made a proposal on pensions that I think is a good starting point to have a serious discussion on it. And just so if you're not familiar with it or haven't really thought about this or heard about it in a while, the real issue with the pension problem is the unfunded liability actuarially over the next 30 years. And when a lot of the proposals heretofore have been only about new employees, whether they're new teachers or new state workers. Those proposals, various proposals have different merits, have different issues, but they don't ultimately deal with that unfunded liability because the unfunded liability is being driven by current beneficiaries. And so any proposal that's seriously going to deal with the pension issue really has to go to that. And that ultimately is going to be important to our school funding as well as other needs that the state has. The governor's proposal on tax revenue, he had initially a fairly broad sales tax increase that included a broadening of the sales tax, not just an increase in the sales tax. That's something that I and many other, both Democrats and Republicans, did not support. And I don't frankly think at the end of the day that is likely to happen. But there has to be some discussion of recurring revenues because we have a $1.2 billion deficit. Before we even talk about putting more money into education funding K through 12, which ultimately would help our school districts stabilize their property taxes, because obviously when the state cuts school funding, the school districts are left with a pretty bad choice of either having to raise property taxes or cut programming, or in some cases, as we've seen over the last 40 years with education cuts, do both. So that piece of it is also important. Obviously, the Marcellus Shale gas severance tax is an important part of it too, and I think there is growing bipartisan support for something like that. So we'll see where that goes. I'm one of, I guess, some of us in the legislature, I'm not sure exactly how many, who have vowed during the budget impasse not to take my salary during that time because I feel as if, this is one of our chief obligations is to pass a budget. And it's important that we have some pressure to do that. I have a bill that would ultimately do that for everybody, but it has not been brought up or passed in the legislature. So in the meantime, I'm abiding by that myself, and some of my colleagues are doing the same thing. We need to keep the pressure on to try to get a deal done. And the longer we go into the fall without a budget deal, the more that a number of different social services that need state support, as well as our schools, are going to start feeling, and that's really important for us. So that's a little bit of an overview. There were some discussions this week. I have not gotten an update on where they have gone, but hopefully, we'll have more progress in September. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions you might have. Yes, Tom.
I just wanted to say I appreciate what you're doing with this flood insurance program. This is absolutely needed in Pennsylvania because it's our state is one of the most affected throughout the country. I see you have 18 co-sponsors already on the bill, including you are getting bipartisan support.
Right.
One of our own realtors from Bucks County, Marguerite Quinn's on with you as well,
right,
which is great.
Right.
How is it progressing? How hard is it to get co-sponsors for the bill? Do you think you're going to be able to move it fairly quick? I know it's in insurance right now.
Yeah, so good questions, and I want to thank Marguerite, by the way, and as you know, she provided us with a statement. She couldn't actually be there in Raleigh that day that we did the press conference, but she provided a statement for us, and that was very important because it really is critical to have bipartisan support to get legislation to move. And Marguerite like me, represents river communities, and she knows well this issue as well as the flooding issue generally. So I think one of the things we've been running up against is summertime. That's point one, and point two is the budget. And so that's taken a lot of energy in Harrisburg, and it's focused it away from issues like this. I think as we get into the fall now and we come back into session, there will be a renewed opportunity to start reaching out across the aisle and frankly within my own caucus as well to build some more support. So this is a particularly good time for you all to get engaged as we get back to Harrisburg to say, hey, you know you have the budget and we know that's an important issue, but you can't take your eye off this ball either, and you need to chew gum and walk at the same time. So, please, think about this. So I'll be actively doing that, and I'll certainly keep you all in the loop as we move forward and we send out letters to my colleagues. And a lot of what I do is, especially with an issue like the budget, when we're sitting on the floor of the House for a long time, it does give me the opportunity to get up and walk around the chamber, and my colleagues are a captive audience at that point, and I can come over and actually talk to them and say, hey, I've got this legislation, I would really appreciate your support. Part of it also is I'm trying to set up meetings with both the Democratic and Republican leadership in the House and in the Senate, because I'd like to get it in front of the Senate as well, and I'm going to be talking to our senators here too to see if they'd be interested in sponsoring some basically a similar piece of legislation in the Senate. So. Other questions? Yes?
I have kind of a three-part thing. First of all, how would it affect, if we were able to do something, how would it affect the like say what Lower Mayfield did for the other areas? How would that affect the overall FEMA approach to remapping anyway? I mean, are they gonna, if they're not considering Lower Mayfield, would they consider that?
So, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Do you want me to take it one at a time? Okay. So I don't know that it necessarily would affect FEMA's decision-making process. Again, I wish that they had been open to listening to that argument in the case of Lower Mayfield and Yardley. Certainly, our engineers had some very good arguments to make as to why those changes have really reduced the risk of flooding for those particular properties and neighborhoods. And while it wasn't particularly scientific, we did have some pretty heavy storm events since the 2006 flood and since those measures were enacted, where the floodwaters came nowhere near many of those neighborhoods. So, I'm not sure ultimately will have an impact so much on FEMA as it will if, and again, I'm not saying this is what the state program would ultimately be, but if the program that we develop were to incentivize towns to undertake those mitigation efforts, then I think over time it would certainly help reduce the risk. It would certainly help reduce damage, which hopefully would have a positive impact on premium costs. And maybe over time it would get FEMA to reevaluate its method for deciding who's in the floodplain and who isn't. But at the very least, it would be an incentive system for the state to help make sure that these municipalities are taking similar steps so that we can reduce flooding risks over the course of time.
And the second part is it possible, we're talking about the homeowners that bought under a certain set of circumstances and then they can't sell.
Right.
Is it possible to grandfather those people, at least eliminating the huge tax where they are? And of course, the people that bought would have to pay more, but it wouldn't make selling that much easier, but it might make the people that are living there be able to live there.
Yeah, well, again, looking at it from a subsidy standpoint from the state, because that's what we'd be talking about, is would essentially be a state subsidy. There are lots of different ways that the task force could propose. I mean, that's another option that the task force could look at in terms of how we would structure the money going out. So I think those are things, again, why I think it's a good idea to have a task force that studies it and considers both the potential benefits and possible shortfalls in doing that kind of an approach.
Yeah, and I guess the last part is, if you've got people that are living in areas where they're fighting just to keep their kids in decent schools,
Right.
is it really fair to them to have to pay for the people on the river to maintain the insurance?
Yeah, so here's the thing at the end of the day, and I've heard that argument from a number of different people, right? It's one thing when someone buys a property with full notice of what the issues are, right? Because under our system of commercial law and real estate law, when you're on notice, you're on notice, and you buy subject to a risk, and everyone goes in with the maximum amount of information, and presumably you make a decision based on all that information, and you balance it out, and you decide that it makes sense or it doesn't. But when you're in a situation where someone has changed the rules midstream, and you've relied on one set of facts, and now those facts have been changed, when you've already made that fundamental decision, which is where I'm buying my home, my primary residence, my greatest asset in many cases, to change that is fundamentally, I think, unfair, and creates this problem that we're talking about. Now, it is in, I would argue, everyone's interest in that affected community, whether you live on the floodplain or you don't, to make sure that those neighborhoods do not ultimately become vacant lots.
Yeah.
Because that has an impact on crime, it has an impact on the desirability of the overall community from a perspective of people who are looking to move there. And it has an impact on the schools and the tax base, because now if we have these homes where no one is living there anymore and no one's paying taxes, well, that's going to mean that the school system is losing revenue, the municipality is losing revenue, the county is losing revenue. Every governmental entity that relies on that property tax is going to be hurt by it, and that means that potentially those taxes then rise over time. So I would argue that everyone has a stake in this. And it's in our interest to try to fashion some kind of remedy. And I think doing it on the state level spreads the cost of that over the entire Commonwealth, so that you don't have one particular community that's taking up the laboring oar. Again, I'm sorry to keep using these, these water-related metaphors, but I think that's nonetheless a more equitable way to do it.
Well, it doesn't our real estate law on eminent domain affect people unfairly all the time? I mean, they go in and do things that bring their property values down constantly.
Well, potentially, yes, depending upon how it's used, right? But that doesn't mean that we should accept yet another level of unfairness, in my view.
Yeah,
right.
I don't think that there's one. I'm kind of for the grandfather idea.
Yeah.
Of giving those people at least some break.
Some break, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that we see that all over the
Yeah,
place.
and that again, that could be part of the mix. I mean, there are lots of different ways that a state subsidy program could be structured. But it's a good point. Thank you. Thanks. Other questions? I think there was someone else. Yes.
I'm just wondering, what's the best way for us to reach out and help support your bill?
Mm-hmm. So I think, let me give you the ranking of, from the standpoint of a legislator, when we hear from constituents and other people who are advocating for a position, phone calls are always the most effective. When you hear from someone over the phone, letters are the next best thing, and then emails. I would stay away from, to the extent you can, a form email. I mean, if you want to put together talking points that you could put into a letter or an email message, that would be great. But I tell you, when you get, your email box gets clogged with 100 of the same thing, it has, I think, a little bit less of an impact than when you get more individualized communication from people. So that's important. So those are individual communications with individual legislators. Then there would be actually advocating with the leadership, because at the end of the day, the leaders are the ones who decide what legislation actually moves. So there's two different levels in this. One of them is building co-sponsors. The request of individual legislators is, please sign on to this bill. Then the second request is to leaders to say, okay, this bill is building support, please make sure it's brought up in committee. You know, whether you need to start with a hearing, which is fine, and then a committee vote, because the way the process works is every bill gets assigned to a committee, a standing committee that deals generally with the topic at hand. So in this case, it's the insurance committee. The insurance committee needs to consider the bill, make potential amendments, and then pass it out of committee before it gets to the floor for a vote. That's generally the rule. There's a procedure where you can bypass that, but hardly ever happens. Then it needs to go to the House floor, where it's considered on 3 different days. The first day is mostly a formality where it's read across the office and people know what the bill is. The second day is when the bill can actually be amended. And that's when any member can propose an amendment that's considered on the floor. And then the third day is when it's voted on final passage. And when it's passed on final passage is when it goes to the Senate. So the request for the leadership is, you know, to the chair of the insurance committee, to the Speaker of the House and the leaders of both the House and the Senate, on both the Republican and Democratic side, please make sure this bill gets brought up. Okay, so that's really what we need to do. And again, I will do everything I can. If we can get it going in the Senate as well, and that gives us 2 bites of the apple, that's great. And I don't care whose name is on it at the end of the day. Yeah.
Okay, so you're proposing to do the study to what municipalities are affected by this? I mean, how many numbers of, how much money? There's a lot of cities along the Susquehanna, the Delaware, Streamside, Harrisburg. I mean, I can think of a lot of places. It's monumental. Where is the funding going to come from? What's the proposal?
Well, so
just the budget.
So that's why we're starting with the task force, because we have to answer all those questions, right? So actually, we had a map at the press conference that Todd participated in of Pennsylvania with all the various rivers and tributaries and floodplains, and it is enormous. I mean, we are one of the highest. Our state has one of the highest claim rates in the country. It's in the top 10, I believe. So it is an enormous problem. And what you need to do is not just identify those areas, but then get a better sense of how many homes in those areas are being affected or impacted by FEMA's mapping program. And then once you have a sense of what that is and what that differential is between what they were getting before at the federal level by way of a subsidy and what they are not getting now, and what the additional cost is going to be over time, then you have to take a look at that and say, okay, what reasonably can we afford as a state, right, to help us out? Now, we're never going to be in a position where we can make up the entire difference. I don't think that's realistic. But I do think once we have a sense of what the total problem is, we can start talking about how we fund that. And as I said before, it's fortuitous that we have this discussion now when at the same time the legislature is considering a budget which I hope will result in recurring revenue, so that we're not, as we have been in the last, I think really since I've been a member of the legislature, every year looking at a budget deficit that we have to figure out how we're going to close that deficit. That's been the case obviously since the Great Recession. And that impacted, obviously, not just Pennsylvania, but states across the union. But we are constantly in this position where, you know, we have a $1 billion or $2 billion, even at one point as high as a $4 billion shortfall. So having some kind of recurring revenue helps us to resolve that, and then gets us to a point, hopefully, where we've got a revenue source that we can use to address a situation like this.
So what are the ideas for the revenue source? Is it something that we haven't looked at before? Is it something new that you would say, you know, maybe we start this kind of taxation or something like that?
Again, I'm not going to, this is what the task force has to do, right?
Okay.
So my idea, because, you know, to get the maximum amount of buy-in, and as I said before with respect to, for example, the school funding formula issue, you really do need to have a bipartisan group looking at this issue in depth and then coming up with a proposal. That is the best way to actually get buy-in and get a piece of a proposal passed. And I've seen this, I used to be a member of the local government commission, And the Local Government Commission, which was a bipartisan, bicameral group, would often look at local government issues and come up with proposals on how to deal with them. And the great thing about the commission is because it's bipartisan, because it's bicameral, because it has a staff that looks very closely at a lot of these issues, when it comes up with a legislative proposal, it's almost always approved because everyone knows that it does a thorough job and that there's buy-in on both sides. And so that puts you in the best position to get something done. I could come out with a proposal tomorrow. I would try to get all this information, but it would be tough for me with my limited staff to get all that. But it would have a far more difficult time passing because it would not have had this broad input. And I want to make sure we get this right.
So it's $12.99 mostly to get the task force done?
Absolutely, that's exactly what it does. Yeah, and the task force, it's a 6-month period, so we're not talking about years. We're talking about a finite period of time because there is some urgency there. And I think that there has been a lot of discussion on this issue, so we should be able to move it forward. Good question. Yes.
How do the banks feel about this flood insurance being imputed because of the change in FEMA's plans and the flood insurance doubling and tripling for some people in Marty Borough? It's almost prohibitive if they can continue to live there.
Right.
And if they have some of the problems, the bank is going to get the house back.
Right. And then be stuck with a house that they can't market. It's a good point. I haven't spoken to the banks yet, but that's something we should do because I think they would have an interest in. They should naturally have an interest in this as well. So thanks. That's a good point. I would do that. I'm sorry if everyone. Sometimes when the fan comes on, it gets a little hard to hear. So sure. Any other questions? Yes.
Just maybe I'm 2 steps behind here. My experience that we're finding that only with a change of property is this issue coming up with the change of the flood insurance premium. Am I hearing that it's just automatically they're being told that the flood insurance premium is now different and now they have to pay more? I mean, that's a question. For Yardley or for Lower Field or anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said.
Yeah.
No, if you sell, if you stay, are your premiums being automatically?
Everybody. Yeah. And it's not just the other piece of it too is people who have up until now not had to get flood insurance because they were not in the floodplain. Now suddenly they are, and the insurance is astronomically higher than it otherwise would have been.
We have a property listed on the overlooking the Delaware.
Right.
On the Delaware, it's here, on the water. And the current flood insurance company is stating that they will.
It's transferable.
That it's transferable at the same rate.
At the same rate.
Yeah. Some insurance policies have an assignment clause.
Okay. That allows it.
And it states that if a new